Oh, hey.
So you said you were going to shut up when I pushed the button. You're supposed to start talking after I push the button.
No, I've shut up. That's it. I'm done.
That's it? You're not talking for the rest of the
No,
show?
no, I'm done.
We're losing Chris Anderson early, folks. Calling Chris Anderson in. What palatial place are you tonight?
This square box that I am currently in is in Nettuno in Italy. So we
Nettuno
are,
in Italy. Oh, fantastic. So you're
yeah,
enjoying sunny Italy and the
we
beautiful
are.
climes and
Yeah, we spent the day in Monte Cassino, and tomorrow is the Anzio beachhead. So yeah.
all right. Well, that's good for you. And as you
Eh,
can probably recognize,
You are in like the central studio, the home
the
office, so to
same
speak.
old pop stand,
Yeah. How
SOP.
how are
Pardon?
things in Chicago?
Things are sunny in Chicago and
Excellent.
with, you know, just a little bit of ice. So,
A little bit of ice.
yeah, there you go. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for bringing you the show and for bringing Chris to Italy. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH
Podcast. Ooh,
podcast,
that's very good.
yeah, we're glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about artist Henri Matisse during World War II. So let us know what you're drinking and where you are. And a lot of people have let us know what the weather is, so you can
Yeah,
do that.
yeah,
Um, and we should thank Chris, everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our
absolutely.
much credited top shelf patrons,
Yes.
and they deserve that credit.
They absolutely do, and we really do appreciate it.
We
And I've
do.
noticed that the fonts have shifted and moved, and Susan is hanging out there all by herself again. So if we could just
Okay, right. And
level that off.
we may have to do a redesign. I'm gonna have to go through and make sure everybody's paid up. So I've gotten a
Oh,
few
okay.
checks lately from people who are paying by check instead of on Patreon. But if you
Ah,
want to
okay.
become a top shelf patron, probably the best way to do it is go to patreon.com/history happy hour. Now, Chris, before we get to our guest, we do have another
Yes.
thing we have to deal with here,
Do we?
uh, which is I asked in our newsletter
Yeah.
this month which one of us is the best dressed tour guide. Now,
I thought I already won that.
don't don't you won on one vote that you saw. I
Ah,
don't. Yeah, but so this I posted these pictures of us on the road, and
yeah.
so Chris, I like your jacket. What kind of jacket do you call that?
That is a Tyrolean jacket that
A
I got in
Tyrolean
Austria. I
jacket.
got that in Austria.
Fantastic. And what is your hat there? That's
Yeah. That is from Lock and Co., which is the oldest shop in London. So,
fantastic.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I'm wearing a patchwork vest that I
Which
bought
are that is the like the leavings of a tweed shop, I think,
in
isn't
Barneville Carteret. It's
it? Ah,
Irish vest, but I bought it across the water from Ireland in Normandy. And of course, I'm wearing a poppy bow tie. I wore a different bow tie every day on
I
this
saw.
trip.
Yeah, I saw you kind of like trying to pump the curve there by posting pictures of your bow tie.
I was definitely pumping the curve. I haven't
All
heard
right.
that, but yeah.
Uh,
But hey, let us know in the comments who's the best dressed, and later on I'll announce that Chris won. So you can you can do that. Don't pay no attention to the way he's dressed now
yeah, no,
because
this is
he's off
it's
duty from tour guguiding.
yeah.
Chris, we have anybody watching, or have they all stopped after all
No,
this?
we have Harold Boltz is joining us, Susan Skelly, who wisely voted for me, so that's good. John Langelier, he says it's 85 degrees in Arizona, but he does have a single malt, so that's good. Ken from Kansas. Ron, who again voted wisely. Katiki Miller. So, and who do you see?
Oh gosh, Ted Mueller, R.J. Griscom, is he on your trip? Because
He
he's in
is.
Nettuno, so
Well, I would
I'm
hope
thinking
so.
he's on your
Yeah.
either that or there's somebody who's following you there, and all sorts of other good people. But listen, we should probably start the show because Christopher will
We
get
should.
bored,
Yeah.
and so why don't you give me a cue and I'll try to get this baby rolling.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and Chris, what's on tap?
Yeah, well, we're really pleased to have Christopher Gorham back. Christopher is a HAH alum. He was on previously to talk about the book, The Confidant. But this week we are here to talk about his new book, Matisse at War, Art and Resistance in Nazi-Occupied France. So we're looking forward to that. So, Christopher,
Welcome,
thank you for
Christopher.
joining us. And he's well
John,
prepared.
What
great to
kind
see
of
you, man. Great to see you, Rick and Chris, and to be in the company of such handsome and dapper gentlemen. I raise my hat to you and salute.
Well put,
Okay.
sir. Well put.
Thank you. Chris, do you have a cocktail?
Well, I hesitate to call this a cocktail, but the mini bar says it's a Beck's. So,
Okay. Well, I'm
and
having an
you?
IPA, good old
Ah,
American beer.
very
Chris, at
good.
least you have a Peroni or something like that, right?
I know, but well, they didn't even stock it with Peroni. I'm kind of disappointed. Maybe tomorrow. But all right. So
We're all looking at
we
you, Chris, because really
okay.
it's you have to ask the question.
I am. So I at the start of the book, Christopher, you say you have a quote, and it says Matisse's face does not suggest his talent. He looks a healthy, well-to-do bourgeois. So for those people who are coming to this fresh, who is Matisse, and at what point in his life does your story begin? Because obviously, he's got a reputation, but where is he at when your story starts?
Well, Matisse, Henri Matisse is the great French modernist. I think most listeners and watchers would can close their eyes and picture a Matisse, maybe the Blue Nude or Dance or something like that. Um, he's French. He's born in 1869. So by the time the action opens in my book in the late 1930s, the eve of the Second World War, Matisse is in his late 60s and not in the best of health, as you can see there. White of beard, bald of pate, and still holding on to his paintbrushes. His reputation has taken a hit during these years. By the 1930s, he's no longer seen as the tip of the avant-garde. He is, as the quote suggests at the top of the show, people meet him at this time and they think he's a real estate or an insurance salesman. He's well tailored, he's well fed, but he's not striking anyone as the leader of modernism anymore.
Yeah.
So, your book is beginning, let's say, roughly in the 1930s, 1935, 1938, something around there. What is the situation with his family at this point? Because family plays a big part in his book.
He was the kind of father and husband, Rick, who needed the family support. He needed a unified family support, and he basically got that. His wife Amelie was essentially his studio manager for many years until she sort of aged out and handed that over to his daughter Marguerite. But by the time we get to the 1930s, Marguerite has married and she's off leading her own life. One of his sons is in New York. The other son is trying to get his career off the ground. And Matisse finds himself, not only his artistic reputation, has sort of bottomed out, but he finds himself without that support network that has sustained him for so many years.
Yeah. So obviously the book is focused on a particular period of his life, and it's certainly a traumatic period for French artists. And I hate to like pull up another quote, but I'm going to read this again because this really struck me. In talking about the 1940s and the rise of fascism and all these sorts of things, Marguerite, his daughter, says it's better not to think about it too much. The future looks like an abyss. There was a sense that the old world had self-immolated and that the new world would arrive with a violent birth. The uneasiness of these ravaged years, Pierre, his son's words, seeped into the cracks and folds of the artist's consciousness. So maybe you could talk about how world events are affecting him.
One of the criticisms of Matisse, this goes all the way back to the 1930s, if not even a little bit before. But one of the criticisms that has dogged Matisse for the decades was he's a painter of pretty things. He's a
Yeah.
painter of flower vases and models and couture, and he's indifferent. He's the criticism is he's indifferent to the events around him, the traumas around him. And I think, Chris, nothing could be further from the truth, because
Right.
as you suggested in the quote there, the letters among the family are full of warnings and anxieties about the future. Matisse himself, by the interwar years, by the years of 1918 to 1938, those 2 decades, he's spending a lot of time in Nice, in the southeastern corner of France, near the Italian border, and he's writing to his kids, hey, this guy Mussolini is going to invade and he's going to take over Nice, and we're very, very afraid of that. So the idea that Matisse was somehow indifferent to history, I think, is not borne out by the letters, and neither is it borne out by the art, because he was the type of artist who filtered those anxieties through his art. And he's not going to paint the Charge of the Light Brigade, and he's not going to paint slogans, but he is, through his art, going to let his anxieties known if you're paying attention.
So after the Germans invade France in June of 1940, Matisse decides to stay in France. He's offered a chance at one point to come to the U.S., turns it down. How unusual a decision was this at that time, and why did he decide to do it?
May, June 1940, scores of artists are leaving, composers, writers, poets. Now there's obviously Jewish artists and notables and intellectuals that, are getting out of harm's way. But for non-Jewish artists, a lot of them are getting on the nearest steamship or going to the nearest railway station to get out. Matisse's son, like I said, his son Pierre was in New York, and he says, Dad, I have a position for you at Mills College near Oakland, California. Matisse himself had a visa to Rio de Janeiro in his breast pocket. And others are saying, you're a 70-year-old guy, you're not in the best of health, go to New York, go to the United States. And he likens it to desertion, Rick. He says, if everyone of value leaves, what will become of France? And this is important because you think of Picasso spending World War II in occupied Paris, a very brave gesture, a very brave thing to do. But let's not forget, Picasso's Spanish. He's living in France. He's made Paris his home, but he's a Spaniard by birth. And Matisse is French, and he is the think about Picasso and Matisse as the twin pillars of modernism. He's the French pillar of modernism, and he defiantly remained in his country and continued to work.
So, and what, Christopher, what would be the opposition of the Nazis, of the fascists, to somebody like Matisse? Why would he be under threat?
Well, what you can do, and what they did in fact do to both Matisse and Picasso is, I've gotten a lot of questions on my book tour. Was Matisse arrested, for instance, like that, or was he threatened with arrest? And the answer is no. He's, like I said, he's an older man. He's an elderly man. His doctors thought he was going to die in 1941. He's living in Nice, which is in the Vichy area, the collaborationist South. So he's not even up in occupied Paris like Picasso. But what the authorities can do and did do is they can molest these guys. They can bother these guys. So in Picasso's case up in occupied Paris, groups of Germans can come by his atelier. They can say, hey, you're Jewish, aren't you? They can barge in and tip over his artworks, steal some linens, and otherwise make his life, just let him know that they're watching him. And in Matisse's case, the sort of Achilles heel for him was his companion in these years is Lydia Delectorskaya. So after the family units kind of dissolved, the family had brought on a helper named Lydia Delectorskaya to care for Matisse's ill wife, and she becomes the model, the muse, the studio manager, and she's also Russian. So the deal with Matisse was, we're going to ask for Lydia's papers. We're going to dig into that because obviously the Germans hated the Russians at this point. So that's how they sort of dealt with these two. And of course, neither one of these guys is Jewish. So that's a whole other story. Someone like Chagall has to get out of France to save his life.
Right. Well, I mean, Rick, let me just add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is it about Matisse's art that would so offend a fascist that he would feel under threat?
Going back to 1937, Chris, the Nazi state in 1937 opened up what they called the Degenerate Art Exhibition, a traveling exhibition of art that was in Germany that was considered an insult to German feeling, an insult to German womanhood, an insult to German sentiment. And Matisse, Picasso, Jewish artists, whether they were German or not, are taken off the walls of museums throughout Germany, taken out of collections throughout Germany. And what made it so is the very nature of modern art. It's arguably complicated sometimes to look at. It's maybe not pleasing like a traditional landscape would be. And
Mhm.
the Germans, and they weren't correct even to even think this, but the Germans equated modern art with sort of Bolshevism and real enemies of what the German right wing was trying to do. That wasn't even always the case, but they associated modern art, the artwork of a person like Matisse, as insulting and ugly and childlike. All the things that we've probably heard if we've spent times in museums, and
Yeah.
it's just ripped off the walls. And millions of Germans jeer these artworks as it crisscrosses Germany, 1937, 1938. So in a way, he's an enemy of the German state.
Well,
Yeah.
and yet, right? So there's a picture you have in your book, and here's Hermann Goering on the lower left. And what's he doing? Isn't he looking at artworks by Matisse? And he's not jeering at them or throwing eggs at them. He's probably about to throw them on a train and take them someplace. So it's a little bit of a complicated story, isn't it?
How deeply cynical that is, to see Reichsmarshal Goering, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. It didn't matter to him at the moment that you're looking at this photograph from 1942. It doesn't matter to Goering that Matisse has Jewish dealers, Paul Rosenberg. He has Jewish collectors like the Steins or the Cohn sisters. All that matters is he likes these paintings for his own personal collection, or in other cases, he would take modern artworks and they would sell them to get the sort of the old masters that they all coveted. So a deeply cynical moment here in Paris under the swastika.
Yeah. So, but I want to. You've touched on this a bit, but I think we should kind of get into it a bit more. What does it say about Matisse that he doesn't leave? Is that a conscious decision? Is he just kind of an old man who says, "I got too much shit around the house and I just can't be bothered"? Or is this an act, a statement,
There's
a stand?
Yeah, I think he had two children that were still in country, and an estranged wife and a companion, not to mention friends. So part of him, obviously wants to stay from that perspective. But his first biographer, Alfred Barr, first American biographer who knew Matisse personally, he said, even at the time, Matisse was aware that by staying in France, he was making a statement. He was not leaving like the other so many of the other notables for safety, for high ground. And so there's evidence that he was aware of this. And moreover, there are some very, very interesting people that in some cases risk their lives to come meet Matisse during the occupation. One of them is, of course, Louis Aragon, who becomes known as the poet of the resistance. Aragon's a surrealist poet. He's a veteran of the humiliated French army. He was evacuated from Dunkirk. Well, he gets back to France and he basically risks his life because he's on the Gestapo hit list to go down to Nice to sit with Matisse and meet the man who is so important, who upholds the values of Frenchness and French, culture. And it's a very moving moment in the book. And Henri Cartier-Bresson, the famous photographer, escapes a German work camp, goes down to Nice, meets with Matisse. And lastly, Françoise Gillot, who is Picasso's companion during these years, she's in her mid-20s during the years of occupation. She said to young people, we knew the poets, Eluard and Aragon, the resistance poets. But for someone like Matisse, she says he was a beacon to us young people for staying,
Mhm.
continuing to work.
We mentioned earlier, Chris mentioned, or you did, a young woman who comes into his life around 1932, Lydia Delektorskaya, if I'm saying that remotely correctly. And she plays a big part in this book. Can you tell us about her relations to his family, and answer that question that just naturally occurs, which is, were they lovers?
Yeah. Lydia Delektorskaya is hired by the family in 1932 in Nice. There she is some years later to be a caretaker for Matisse's ill and depressed wife, Amélie. And Matisse at first calls her very nastily. He would just sort of make these remarks like, well, she's the Russian help for my wife, which is a terrible thing to say. But one day in 1935, while Lydia was at the house doing her work. She's wearing a striped work shirt. Matisse says, "Hold still." And he grabs his sketchbook and he makes a pencil sketch of her. That pencil sketch becomes the painting that you see right there, The Blue Eyes, one of the most famous Matisse paintings of all his magnificent works. And really, from that moment on, Amélie says, his wife says, it's me or her. And Matisse, of course, chooses Lydia. And Lydia Delectorskaya becomes the support apparatus that Matisse so needed. It was no longer his wife. It was no longer his daughter, Marguerite. Now it's Lydia. And she will spend, the rest of his life. She'll spend the rest of all the way up until 1954 with him, all through the war years, all through the years of occupation. She'll be at his side, keeping him healthy, keeping him creative. And to your question, there's a split.
No, I was gonna. If you didn't answer it, I was gonna circle around back to you on it. So
there's a sort of split of authority. Hilary Sperling, the biographer of Matisse, back in about 20 years ago, she did the 2-volume, just wonderful, 2-volume biography of Matisse. She says that there was not amorous relations between Matisse and Lydia. Other people say, you lose me there, because there's an account of Picasso coming to visit one day, and Matisse is, sort of behind a sheet that's hanging in one of his studio rooms, and he's yelling "cuckoo," looking for Lydia. So, and Picasso witnesses this. So there's evidence that, there's evidence that it was not a chaste relationship. But then there's a counter to that, because for her entire life, Lydia referred to Matisse in the vous form, the formal French form. He was the patron, the boss, the sir, and she never deviated from that, as we know. But I guess I leave it up to the readers to look at the clues in the book and to make their own judgments as to what the relationship was like.
And can you just, Chris, if it's okay, can you just also talk about her relationship with his children? Obviously, with his wife, not so great. What's her relationship with his children, who are, right, his sons are Jean and Pierre, and the daughter is Marguerite?
It was very fraught, Chris and Rick. The relationship between the 3 children and Lydia was just not great. I mean, there's full stop. There's no split of authority there. That's a fact. Elderly father, estranged from the mother, had literally said, she said it's me or her. He chooses Lydia. It's a bad look. Matisse was well aware of this. He says they're rumor mongering about me in America. They're rumor mongering about me in London and in Paris. And so was well aware of this. And Marguerite, the daughter, has to swallow her pride on occasion because of her father's ill health and go down to Nice, interface with Lydia. And the 2 women have to work together to keep him safe and to keep him healthy. And as for Pierre, he too has to sort of make with Lydia later in life, because she was the only person who knew when Matisse was dead and gone. She was the only person that Pierre could talk to about the cutouts and the artwork that he was doing late in his life with any authority. So he needed to sort of make peace with her as well. But the warm feelings were just never there.
Chris?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Oh yeah. No, I was. I think Chris Anderson might be frozen, so he's probably going to have to come back to us.
It's cold in that part of Italy this time of year.
And his internet has been so perfect. From it could be that he's just pausing. If we could all think that he maybe was just pausing to kind of think of what his next question was. But since we talked about his family a little bit, oh, hang on. There you go. Are you with us, Chris?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Well, go ahead. You can ask a question. We did say some things about you while you were gone, but the audience, guys, if you're watching, you can fill Chris in on any of the terrible things we said about him. Yeah.
So, one of the dilemmas, or one of the things that you discuss in the book, is the choices that these artists are making. And Matisse writes in relation to Picasso, and he says Picasso, still has the human dignity that his colleagues have abandoned to an unbelievable degree. So, and you talk about several artists who make that choice. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that dilemma and how people are making those choices.
France was a bitterly divided country, I'm sorry to say. I think a lot of your listeners and watchers will know this. France had certainly its share of far right supporters, especially in the South. Nice becomes sort of the nexus of the French right wing, toughs, militia groups under the command of a guy named Joe Darnand, who is considered by United States intelligence to be something of like a French, Himmler, a really, really nasty guy. And so, and in fact, Darnand and his street toughs took the terrible, the Roman salute, the oath of French fascism in a Roman amphitheater right across where Matisse was living. So this is close to home, quite literally in the case of Nice at the time. And so French people had to make a difficult decision. They had to throw in their lot with the forces of reactionaryism, or they had to uphold what they thought was French Republican values, liberty, equality, fraternity, and so forth, and diversity, open-mindedness, and the like. And bitterly just disappointed Matisse that some of his old painting mates did not share or did not have the wherewithal to uphold those values, and they tipped over into sort of collaborationism with the Nazi art group in 1942. One of these guys, a guy named Andre Durand, had been so close to Matisse. He was a younger artist than Matisse, but he'd been quite a follower of Matisse in the Fauve era, the wild beast of French painting. And at one point, Durand's parents said, "Well, we can't let you take a career in art because it's not a noble career." And Durand says, "Well, I have an older friend who's a painter, and he dresses conservatively, and he once trained as a lawyer. He'll come talk to you for dinner and change your mind." And so Matisse did. He changed their mind. Durand becomes a painter in the model of the Fauves under Matisse. And then in 1942, bitterly disappointing to Matisse, Durand is one of the artists who throws in their lot with the Germans and goes on a tour of the Third Reich to see the Nazi sculpture of Arno Breker. So just Matisse used the word ghastly and lamentable to talk about this episode.
And I mean, he refuses to be exhibited with some of these people, and he makes it pretty clear how he feels.
Absolutely, and he could be a man of a real economy of words. Matisse could, but when it came time to, in his letters to his son Pierre in New York, when this discussion came up, he was quite candid and quite strong in his emotions. This was a terrible thing that his one-time mates had done, and moreover, Vlaminck, the other former Fauve who threw in his lot with the Germans, was accusing Picasso of being Jewish in the newspapers, which is a very dangerous game, obviously, at this time. So Matisse was bitterly disappointed and felt betrayed by both of these two men.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the book a quote that has been attributed to both Picasso and Matisse, which goes like this: "We must talk to each other as much as we can. When one of us dies, there will be some things that the other will never be able to talk about with anyone else." So can you talk about Matisse's relationship with Picasso? I mean, they both stayed in France, as we've discussed. They're friends, they're competitors. Kind of what stands out to you about this relationship during World War II?
Well, I hope that readers would find what I found when I was conducting the research, which is I came into this thinking, hey, Picasso's a jerk. David McCullough was going to write a biography of him and decided I'm not going to because I don't want to live for 5 or 6 or 7 years with a jerk. So that became, he went over and did the Truman biography. And
a trivia question I didn't know. Okay.
Yeah, and we know, obviously Picasso is very unchivalrous with the women in his life and just kind of a nasty guy. So that was what I came into the research sort of knowing in quotes. What I found, gentlemen, was a more complicated story. Picasso is a rival of Matisse, but the younger Picasso really venerates Matisse and as a living modernist in a way that he respected no other modernist during his life. Picasso would collect Matisses. He would borrow stylistically from Matisse. He would pay visits to Matisse when he could, and it was and in some cases would even be very protective of the elderly and frail Matisse. So it was a more complicated story, and one that, even though they're rivals and they're sort of waging this war of ideas with each other, it was a gentlemanly war. And it was a relationship that I found complicated and moving in a lot of ways.
Well, there's this great scene in your book where Picasso's visiting with Matisse, and he's brought his girlfriend. You can remember her name is Gillot, and then Matisse wants to paint her, and Picasso gets jealous about it, right? So he's got to be getting on in years at this point, but he's still pretty much the young sexually aggressive guy, right?
Right. It was, Francois Gillot is such a wonderful resource just because she was there and knew both of these men extremely well. And she was a painter herself, a colorist herself, and really loved Matisse in a lot of ways. And, she presents Picasso like the charging bull, head down and feet stomping and charging after someone like Matisse. And Matisse, just pulls the cape away and wins the day. And, yeah, so it's rivalry, a friendship, but a rival, but a friendship that was undergirded with a real rivalry.
And do you think, Christopher, that I guess what Matisse represented during the war and the stand that he took, does it improve his reputation? Because I know at the beginning of the book you say he's almost kind of yesterday's news, right?
Yeah.
He's so does this period revive his standing in the art world?
Well, what I observe is, and I'm not the first to do this, but Matisse's reputation has there have been waves where he's very, very popular. One of those waves was in the mid 1980s with sort of the loosening of the Soviet Union grip on their big collection of Matisses that they had, and sharing those with the Western world. And there have been decades where Matisse's reputation fell. The stock was falling, and I think at the moment, right now, 2024, 25, 26, Matisse's stock is up. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There's the Marguerite and Matisse exhibit that just closed at the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. There's another one that opened up in Nice on October 1st. And there's beautiful, and the painting is about that size too. It's about 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, but a very moving thing to see face to face. And there's another exhibit opening up in the spring in Paris, which will cover Matisse's output from 1941 to 1954, the years really essentially of my book. So he's having a moment. The late, great, venerable French modernist is having another moment, one of several waves of popularity that the decades have done for him. And I'm here for it. And I'm glad that the timing looks good for my book.
Yeah.
Well, one of the themes of the book is that Matisse kind of has a rebirth, maybe you would say, in the war, developing some new styles of his art, perhaps offering hints of resistance in some of these works. Can you talk about that? And you've sent us some pieces, so maybe we can show a few of those pieces as you discuss that.
Sure, and to understand his World War II output, he had a abdominal surgery, very emergency abdominal surgery in 1941. It didn't go very well. His doctors said, you're likely to die in 1941 or 1942. But what it leaves Matisse in a situation where he can't stand up at the easel anymore, not for any length of time. So he has to figure out a new way to create. And creation, this guy, what he ate, what he drank, what he didn't drink, his sleeping habits, to the extent he could get some sleep, were all directed to waking up with the sun the next morning and creating. So he had to find a way to create. And you see him there in that photograph, ill, bedridden, but still holding on to the brushes. So what he does is he has to work sitting down, either on the bed or in a wheelchair. And he takes these big, thick pages of sheets of Canson paper that are colored with the exacting hues of Matisse. And he and Lydia, he cuts them with scissors, which he knows how to use because his hometown was a textile hub. And he can use scissors with the same acuity as the pencil and the paintbrush. And he cuts out these magnificent shapes. And he and Lydia then sort of pin them on the wall. And Matisse looks and says, that's the composition. And that becomes the prototype for these new works that he does during the war, the cutouts, so to speak, the decoupage, the cut paper works that became quite famous because of this.
Right.
Time.
So here's one. Right. So what's this called?
This is the Fall of Icarus, and he did Icarus, and he did the Fall of Icarus. This one has the sort of the black stripe, Now, commentators, we think of Matisse as pleasant to the eye. You know, one of the sort of criticisms of Matisse or lazy statements about Matisse is he's a painter of pretty things. Well, no, he's not. This is not really a pretty thing. This is an unsettling image of a figure without hands or feet falling through space with what looks like a wound in his chest. And Louis Aragon himself, the poet of the Resistance, who knew Matisse during the years of occupation, said, well, those stars, those jagged stars, they stood for bursting shells in 1942. So this is Matisse at his most latently violent and really showing his anxieties to us, the viewer, in a way that hopefully is eye-opening to some of your viewers and listeners.
Well, there's two. If it's so, Chris, can I show him
Yeah,
two others?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So there's two others just to get your take on, and this is one that you write about in the book. Also, I think it's called The Wolf.
Yes, he is working on this at the moment that he learns that his beloved daughter Marguerite is in real danger. She's been arrested for her resistance activities. She was in the French resistance in a cell. She was denounced or given up by a traitor. She's arrested. That's kind of all he knows at this point. And he takes to another cutout, this one called The Wolf. And, you know, it has the Matisse colors that we love, the fuchsia, the blue that he loved so much, the orange stripe on the right. But the central image, Lydia said that was the beast with the bloodstained eye. And the late curator, Reva Castleman in New York, said, well, the wolf, well, that stood in for the Gestapo. Because indeed, the wolf had Matisse's daughter in its jaws.
So
go ahead,
oh,
Chris.
no, one more. No.
No. I decided to eliminate the last one. So go ahead.
No, I just want you to kind of get more into this because, you know, you say in the book that, you know, Matisse has this reputation of, you know, he should not have symbols and he should not get involved. And you know, you say Matisse isn't going to paint Guernica, right?
Yeah.
Which is very overt. So how is the war, is it changing his art? How is this event, this experience impacting what he does?
I think, Chris, when you go back and you look at his inscrutable, complex, giant sort of masterpieces of World War I, you know, you go back to Bathers by a River, which is at the Chicago Art Institute, or The Piano Lesson, which is a painting of his son. When you look at those and you look at those through the lens of his two sons were fighting for the French army in World War I at that moment that he painted those, it really opens your eyes to how somber they are. And again, Matisse is not a sloganeer. He's not going to throw hand grenade with his art. But if we look at it hard enough, we can kind of see a man who's really wrestling with some issues, some anxiety, some fear about his family, about his country. And you see it again in the cutouts. They're colorful in a way that those World War I paintings are somber, but they are latently violent. There's elements of surveillance. There's elements of wounding. There's so many welt-shaped marks on so many of the plates. And I think it did change him. You know, it changed him in the same way that World War I would have changed him, which is his son said it best. His son said, and his son knew, you know, hundreds of artists, hundreds of modern artists. Pierre was a world famous gallery owner that knew a lot of these guys. And Pierre Matisse told the New York Times in 1942, he said, look, I know a lot of artists, and artists during war, you know, they're not going to paint skulls and shells of, you know, shell fragments. What they're going to do is they're going to interpret the violence, interpret the national trauma in an artistic way that is obviously a little bit more subtle. And it's kind of up to us, the viewer, to look at that and to sort of take that message in.
Christopher, maybe you could talk a little bit about his family in the resistance, because your book is about Matisse and it's about his family. And he is playing a more subtle role, but some of his children are getting quite involved in the resistance. Even Pierre, who we just saw there at his gallery in New York City, is kind of involved in some activities, maybe not resistance exactly, but something close. Talk a little bit about what they did and what Matisse knows about this. Like, is he aware of it? And what's, you know, give us a little bit of that story without, you know, you don't have to let it, you don't have to
Right.
reveal anything that you don't want to reveal, but, you know.
Everyone,
ahead.
you still have to buy the book. No,
Yeah, it's
Exactly,
exactly right.
he has three children, and they each, in their way, take a stand in the war, and for each of them, in a way, the stakes are high. Pierre in New York, he's not part of the team that is literally helping these guys, these artists, escape from the port of Marseille, but he's on the other end. So when a guy like Marc Chagall and his wife, literally, Chagall was in prison briefly in Marseille. When Chagall gets to New York, he says, "I went from death to life." And he looks at Pierre Matisse, which was a famous name, a name that he knew. He knew Pierre Matisse from back in France, and he says, "Now what do I do? I was in Russia, then I was in France, now I'm in New York." And Pierre Matisse gives him a lifeline, gives him a career, and it wasn't just Chagall. It was over a dozen artists, modern artists, that Pierre brought to New York and helped give a platform to. And Americans appreciate the American appreciation of those artists is largely due to Pierre Matisse back in the 40s and 50s. As for his eldest son, Jean was, what Matisse saw was a guy that was all around France. He was in occupied North. He was in the collaborationist South. He was down in Antibes, which is on the Mediterranean Sea. And, there's some reading between the lines. There's some clues that Matisse was worried about his son and wondering what the heck he was doing going all around France. Well, Jean was working with British intelligence. Jean was one of those guys that was under the moonlit night in Antibes, was taking the rowboat out with his son to collect the battery-powered submarine and the British agents that were on board and bringing them ashore and then getting them to their cell where they were needed. So I don't think Matisse knew the extent of that, but I think there are clues that Matisse was there are clues that Matisse knew more than he was letting on, because of course he wouldn't say, he wouldn't let on, if he knew his son was involved in that. And his 50-year-old daughter, Marguerite was a 50-year-old woman at this time. She had sent her son to live in New York out of harm's way. She had told her father, "I will make myself useful in occupied Paris." And she did. And when she goes silent in the correspondence with her father, he gets worried. And his worries were borne out when he finds out that just weeks before D-Day, in fact, that his daughter had been arrested by the Gestapo and was being held somewhere if she was still alive.
Yep. So, kind of continuing on with that the discussion of children and the family, what's the emergency rescue committee, and what's the family's role in that?
The Emergency Rescue Committee was put together in New York, in part by some universities, some art departments, in part by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and and donors, people that put up the money. They sent a man named Varian Fry to Marseille, an American young guy who was very, very smart, and he was the agent who would go to France, who would collect a person like Chagall, who would try to collect a person like Matisse, and get them out of France and get them to New York or to the United States. Well, in Chagall's case, Chagall and his wife were Jewish. Let's get out of town. It's a matter of life and death, and they were quite aware of that. At least Chagall was. But for Matisse, he's staying. He says to Varian Fry 2 times, "I'm not leaving. I'm staying. But what I can do is I can, from within France, if you and the ERC need certain things, I will go ahead and do those things." And it could have meant, and probably did mean, providing art materials to less fortunate artists. They were very hard to come by. There were artists that didn't have paint or brushes, and Matisse did what he could to get those materials to these less fortunate artists. And there's also some inklings. I don't want to get too much into it because it's in the book, but there are also inklings that he was doing more than that. Short of what his 2 children are doing, which they were active resistors.
Right,
So
right.
he wasn't doing that, but there are inklings that he was doing a little bit more than he was letting on.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I found interesting, just as something I didn't know, when the Allies invade North Africa in 1942, of course, a few days later, Germany occupies Vichy France, which I did know. But I thought it was fascinating that there were Italian troops who come to Nice, because that was something I did not know. How long are they there in Nice, and what is the impact of their occupation? I mean, are they viewed as badly as the Germans, or are they much more sympathetic, or kind of what's the story with that?
Rick, I'm so glad you asked that question. I've been out on the road now almost a month. A little over a month for the book. It's been tremendous. Been in many states, and I haven't gotten that question quite as well put. So
Woo-hoo.
yes, yes,
Yeah,
take
that's a touchdown.
yeah, have a sip of that beer, and congratulate. It's a very, very interesting question because Nice is in the southeastern corner of France, next to the on the sort of the Italian frontier. In 1940, in June of 1940, when the Germans have invaded and conquered France, and France is, prostrate before the Nazi, Panzer divisions, Benito Mussolini invades that part of France. He takes his opportunity. FDR says, the Latin neighbor has sunk the dagger into its neighbor's back, and it was dirty pool. But Mussolini wanted Nice because it had been Nizza, the birthplace of the great Italian hero Garibaldi. So armistice papers that were drafted up between the Germans and the French, and now the Italians, that little sliver of land that includes Nice is under Italian jurisdiction from June of 1940 until November of 1942. And the Italians, to answer your question, are not seen like the Germans are going to be seen in the future. They do not consider it their mandate to hunt down Jews and persecute Jewish citizens. So this is the only place in Nazi-occupied Europe or Nazi Europe where Jewish citizens do not have to wear the yellow star, and they're allowed to practice their lives in relative peace. Unfortunately, this is all going to end when the Allies invade North Africa and the Germans realize, hey, Italian laxity down on the coast is not going to cut it. We have to go down there and get rid of the Italians and make our own coastal defenses. And they do take that opportunity to hunt Jews in Nice and the villages around Nice with mixed results. So the Niçois, there were some very, very brave Niçois that were making sure that their efforts were not as successful as they might have been, thankfully. But a very, very interesting history, the city of Nice in World War II. Italian, the German, also the site of Allied bombing. Allies are trying to fight the Germans. The Italians are fleeing, and you have brother against brother in Nice. You have the French right wing, which is sort of the nexus of the French right wing, and then the Maquis, the hill fighters up in the hills outside of town that were taking down the right wing extremists one at a time in cafes. Very, very bloody. So Nice was it was a part of the theater of war. And, for folks that say, hey, Matisse was a painter of pretty things and taking advantage of beautiful seaside Nice, not the case.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that, Christopher, because in his lifetime, this guy has a lot of unfortunate encounters with the Germans.
Yes.
It's safe to say, you talk about his home village is occupied during World War I. He's forced to travel all over France during occupation. He goes to Nice. Then Nice starts getting bombed, and he moves to a little village outside of Nice. He thinks he's going to be left in peace, and then all of a sudden the Germans turn it into a rest and recreation center. So maybe you could talk about how he's dealing with that.
Matisse lived not only through two world wars, but his hometown was taken over in the Franco-Prussian War. Matisse was an infant. Matisse was 1 year old in 1870 and 2 years old in 1871. And his mother had to bury the valuables in the garden. So his hometown in the north is taken over by the Prussians. It's taken over and occupied from 1914 to 1918. His brother is sent during World War I to a German work camp. Matisse is sending, bread and biscuits and paintings and stuff like that to him. And then, of course, in the Second World War, it's occupied again. But going back to when Matisse was a primary school, when he was a schoolboy, they had a song in his hometown that said, "We are the children." Some of the lyrics are, "We are the children of the frontier, born to the smell of gunpowder." And that's an aspect of Matisse that I don't think we appreciate. We think of him so joyful, and to stand before his colorful paintings to be so transcendent in a way, which is all true. But this man lived through 3 wars, and his hometown was occupied all 3 times. So a lot of clouds in that sunny life of Matisse.
Yeah.
So a question that We often ask at the beginning of an interview is what drew you to this story? And I thought I would save this question till now because I wanted people to hear a little bit of the story and understand that it's interesting and complicated. But what drew you to the story? And I was curious how much of it might be your own personal relationship with Nice, which is a place you've spent a lot of time.
Sure. I've always been interested in history. When my grandfather, who had served in World War II, took that cigar box down from the bookshelf and showed me the patches and the medals and the news clippings, it was just love. It was just love. History is my thing. And uh, I was also always interested in sort of the intersection of art and history, art and war, I guess would be a better way to say it. And boy, when I read in my 20s, about the World War I poets, Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, the doomed poets in the trenches, it was just, there's something about the intersection of art and war that I find very, very compelling. So fast forward a number of years, I come across this book called Artists Under Vichy, which is a compilation about the different artists who were living under the collaborationist South. And the scholar that wrote the chapter on Matisse makes the argument that, he was not only latently disinterested in events around him in war or national trauma, but he was sort of tacitly okay with the Patenists, the collaborationist regime. And moreover, she insinuated that he might have even been taking advantage of a Paris that was free of Jews because of the Nazis. And because my wife and I have had the good fortune to spend a lot of time in Nice over the last almost 25 years, I also knew that Matisse's daughter, Marguerite, had served in the French Resistance and risked her life to do that. So I thought, how can you possibly square this? Matisse is a secret collaborationist, but his daughter is also working for the French Resistance. So that was the sort of the birth of the idea. To also answer your question, I don't think if my wife and I hadn't spent so much time in Nice over the years, I don't think I would have been comfortable writing about the great Matisse. But I hope that I've made the city of Nice a character in the book, and his shadow is everywhere in Nice. From where he lived to his museum to the scenes that he painted. So he's a big part of that city, and that gave me a lot of the confidence to write this book.
Yeah. So, the other thing that I often ask folks, especially people who've kind of writing biographical books, having spent as much time with him now as you have, is there anything that surprised you in your research? Is there anything that your opinion changed, or that that you took away from it that you didn't know when you decided to dive into this?
Well, I'll tell you, and it was a pleasure that you called me. I was pleased to be called an HHH alum at the top of the show because you remember my first book, The Confidant, which is the true story of Anna Rosenberg. And in a way, what I learned about Matisse was the thing that it was so inspiring about Anna Rosenberg, which is this. A consistent set of values that doesn't change. Matisse had the values of, he trained as a lawyer. He knew right and wrong. He knew morality. He was married to a progressive woman. So they were, anti-monarchical. They were pro-republic, the French Republic. That was what they stood for. And during the trauma of occupation, when Matisse is seeing so many of his colleagues, throw away those values and take the easy way out, go to bed in some cases, not literally, but go to bed with the Germans and, go over to Nazi Germany and get celebrated. That was never something that he would have considered. So it was his consistency in his values was something that I think he shared with Anna Rosenberg. And this is when, a lot of people aren't sharing those, or a lot of people don't have the stalwart value set. They're able to succumb to the temptations of the new regime. And for Matisse, that was just not going to happen. And I found that very, very, as the research went on, I kept getting sustained by that, because I saw the parallels between he and Anna Rosenberg. Here are people that once they had those values set in place, they were not going to be moved off of those, no matter how trying the times were.
Yeah. So do you have a new project that you're working on? Can you give us a clue about it?
I can give you.
Can we book you in 2 years, or is it going to be a little more uncertain?
Go ahead and set that. Yeah. So that would be my third time, and that would be wonderful. HHHH, I guess. Um, we are not ready to give the details yet, but it does involve art and war, and the war that it involves is the Second World War. So where I'm staying in my
I
wheelhouse.
hope you're not retelling the Ghost Army story. That's
Oh,
all
would you
that I wanted
stop.
Well, I'll give you another hint. Pierre Matisse is in it.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. So
All
Pierre
right,
Matisse.
fair enough.
Not the Ghost Army.
I'm
Rick.
going to check and say I don't think he served in that unit, but
He
I'd
did
have
not.
to.
He did, not to my knowledge.
I'd have to double check that.
God.
Thank you so much, Christopher Gorham, for coming on and talking about your new book, Matisse at War, Art and Resistance in Nazi-Occupied France. Thanks for your second time. You know, if you're on HHH 5 times, you get a hat. We've only got one.
Right faster. Right.
We've only got one person who's gotten one so far, but you know, you're in the hunt there.
That gives me something to shoot for. Chris and Rick and HHH, thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure again. Thank you.
All right.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Well, okay. So we're going to stay. We're in World War II all of November.
We are.
So next week we're going to have on somebody we tried to have on before, but we had some technical difficulty. He's the author of a new book about the saving of the Jews. No, not that book. We had that guy on recently. I think. Yeah, no, that would be this book.
This book.
His name is Tim Brady. He's the author of A Light in the Northern Sea: Denmark's Incredible Rescue of Their Jewish Citizens During World War II. So, which is a great story, and even if you know it, lots of details and interesting stuff in this. So, please come back and join us when Tim Brady comes on the show, and we hopefully will solve all those technical problems that eluded us last time.
I think he's on it this time.
I hope so. So thanks everybody for coming. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky. I should say something about Instagram. Do we even have an Instagram account? We should. I'll start one.
You would tell me, yes.
Listen to our podcast and back us on Patreon. Really important. Back us on Patreon. Yes. And browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.